When I bought the duplex, I was thrilled. It was a great deal, 2 connected homes for the price of one. My plan was simple: live in one half and rent out the other. But the second unit had been vacant for years. The real estate agent shrugged when I asked about it. People move in, then move out. No one stays long, he said. I didn't think much of it. At first, everything seemed normal. I spent my days fixing up my side, painting walls, replacing old fixtures, and cleaning out the yard. But at night, things changed. I would hear noises from the empty unit, footsteps shuffling, soft whispers, and the creak of floorboards. It was subtle at first, like the house was settling. Then, one night, I heard something unmistakable. Knocking. It came from the shared wall between my unit and the empty one. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. Maybe some animal got inside? Maybe a raccoon or a stray cat. I got up, pressed my ear to the wall. Silence. Then another knock. Closer this time. I swallowed hard, lifted my hand, and knocked back. The response was immediate. A series of rapid knocks, growing louder and faster. My blood ran cold. I grabbed a flashlight and my spare key, determined to check it out. The door to the second unit groaned as I pushed it open. Dust swirled in the beam of my flashlight. The air was stale, heavy. The living room was cluttered with old furniture covered in sheets, untouched for years. No sign of intruders. I moved deeper into the house, checking each room. The kitchen, empty. The hallway, silent. The bedroom, my stomach clenched. On the dusty wooden floor, fresh footprints. Bare feet. They led from the wall we shared, and stopped right in the middle of the room. No trail leading out, just a dead end. A feeling of dread crawled up my spine. I spun around, shining my flashlight into every corner. Hello! My voice sounded small, fragile. No response. I backed out of the room, locking the door behind me. That night, I barely slept. The next day, I called a locksmith and had the locks changed on both units. But it didn't stop. Every night, the knocking continued. Sometimes slow, sometimes frantic. Sometimes I heard scratching. A week later, I woke up to find something new: words, faintly scratched into the wooden floor of the empty unit, right beneath the footprints. Let me in. I didn't go back into the second unit after that. I told myself it was just my imagination, that maybe the footprints had been there all along and I just hadn't noticed. But I knew better. Every night, the knocking continued. Sometimes soft and pleading, other times violent and urgent. I stopped knocking back. I tried to ignore it. But then, it changed. One night, instead of knocking, I heard something else. A dragging sound, like heavy furniture scraping across the floor. Then, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Not against the shared wall this time, against my bedroom door. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The tapping continued, steady, deliberate. Then, the doorknob rattled. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and dialed 911. There's someone in my house, I whispered. The operator asked for my address, told me to stay on the line. I crept out of bed, moving as quietly as possible toward my closet. The tapping on the door stopped. A silence stretched so long I could hear my own heartbeat. Then, just as I reached the closet, bang. A single, deafening pound on the door, so strong the wood seemed to tremble. My body locked up in terror. The operator was still talking, but I barely heard her. Then, footsteps, slow, shuffling, moving away from my door, toward the front of the house. A moment later, I heard it, my front door unlocking. Not opening, unlocking. The sound of the deadbolt turning, the latch clicking free. My blood went ice cold. They're getting inside. I gasped into the phone. Sirens. A knock at my actual front door. Police. I sprinted out of the bedroom, throwing the door open so fast I nearly collapsed into the officer's arms. I tried to explain what had happened, but when they searched the house, they found nothing. My front door was locked. The second unit was locked. No footprints, no scratches, no proof. One of the officers, a man with graying hair and tired eyes, pulled me aside before they left. This house, it has a history. People don't stay long. I swallowed hard. Why? He hesitated. Years ago, a man lived in that second unit. He was sick, obsessed with the idea that someone was living inside his walls. He'd hear knocking, whispering. He'd tell people something was trying to get in. I shuddered. What happened to him? The officer exhaled, glancing back at the house. One day, he stopped answering his phone. His family came to check on him. And they found him inside, dead. But the thing is, he hesitated. The doors were all locked. No sign of forced entry. But the furniture, it was all pushed up against the walls, as if he'd been trying to keep something out. Or keep something in. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every groan of the old house sent a spike of fear through me. The officer's words played over and over in my head. The knocking, the footprints, the scratches. The man who lived here before me, he had heard the same things. He had tried to keep something out, or keep something in. The next day, I made a decision. I had to see what was behind that wall. I went to the second unit in broad daylight, sunlight spilling through the dusty windows. I followed the footprints again, stopping in front of the wall where the knocking had come from. If there was something inside, some hidden space, some secret room, I needed to know. I grabbed a hammer and started tapping. Hollow. There was a space behind it. My pulse quickened. I hesitated for only a second before driving the hammer into the drywall. The old, brittle plaster crumbled away in chunks. Dust filled the air. I kept going, widening the hole until I could see inside. And then I wished I hadn't. The space behind the wall was narrow, just wide enough for a person to stand in. And someone had stood there, long enough to leave deep scratches in the wooden beams, long enough for their breath to stain the walls with something dark. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. Then I saw something else. A hole, small at eye level, peephole. I stepped forward, heart hammering, and pressed my eye to it. The view was clear. I was looking directly into my bedroom. A wave of nausea hit me. Someone had been standing inside this hidden space, watching, waiting, listening. The knocking, the scratches, the whispers. Not a ghost. Person. I dropped the hammer and ran, stumbling back into my unit, locking every door behind me. My mind was racing. If someone had been living in that space, where were they now? That night, I barely moved from the couch, a kitchen knife clutched in my shaking hands. I listened. The house was too quiet, too still. And then, sometime around 3 a.m., the knocking started again. But this time, it didn't come from the wall. Came from inside my closet. Couldn't breathe. The knocking was soft, deliberate, just a few feet away. Inside my closet. My body refused to move, frozen in sheer terror. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. Then another knock. Louder. Closer. My mind raced. The hidden space behind the wall. The peephole. The scratches. Someone had been living in this house. Watching me. They had moved through the walls, listening, waiting. And now they were inside my closet. I forced myself to stand, gripping the kitchen knife so hard my fingers ached. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else as I moved toward the door. My breath came in short, panicked bursts. I raised my free hand and slowly reached for the handle. The second my fingers touched the doorknob, the knocking stopped. Silence. Heavy. Oppressive. I swallowed hard and yanked the door open. Empty. My clothes hung motionless, undisturbed. No hidden panels. No gaps in the back wall. Nothing. But the feeling remained. A cold, electric hum in the air. Like something was still there. Watching. Waiting. I backed away, shutting the door, locking it. My heart was still hammering in my chest. I couldn't stay here. I wouldn't stay here. At sunrise, I packed whatever I could fit into my car and left. I didn't care about selling the place, about the money I'd lose. None of it mattered. I just needed to be gone. But as I pulled out of the driveway, I made the mistake of glancing up at the second unit's window. The curtain had been pulled aside, and behind the glass, barely visible in the morning light, was the faint outline of a face, smiling. When I first moved into the house, it had 7 rooms. I knew that for a fact. I had counted them when I toured the place, when I signed the paperwork, and when I walked through with the keys in my hand for the first time. 7. A simple number. But the next day, when I was unpacking, something felt off. The hallways seemed longer. The layout felt different. I ignored it at first, blaming it on exhaustion, but then I counted the rooms again. 8. I stood in the middle of the hallway, gripping the edge of the nearest doorframe, trying to force my mind to make sense of what I was seeing. Which room hadn't been there before? I walked through each one, searching for anything unfamiliar. Bedroom, guest room, kitchen, bathroom. They all felt right. But then I came to a door at the end of the hall. I didn't remember it being there. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob. The metal was cold, unnaturally so. I turned it slowly, pushing the door open. The room was empty. No furniture, no decorations, just 4 bare walls and a single, dust-covered window. But something about it made my skin crawl. The air was stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. My footsteps left imprints in the thin layer of dust on the floor. I backed out, heart pounding, and closed the door. That night I barely slept. My mind kept circling back to the room. It hadn't been there before. Couldn't have been. But somehow it felt like it had always existed. Like a part of my brain had been rewritten overnight. Then, around 2 a.m., I woke up. My room was dark, silent, except for one thing. A slow, deliberate creak. I turned my head toward the hallway. The door to the 8th room was open. Wide open. I stared at the open door, my breath caught in my throat. I was sure I had closed it. I knew I had. The hallway beyond was shrouded in darkness. But the doorframe stood out. A black void against the dim light filtering in from my bedroom window. I told myself it was just a draft, that old houses settle in strange ways. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I forced myself to get up. My legs felt weak as I stepped into the hallway, the floor cold beneath my bare feet. Every step toward the open door sent a fresh wave of unease through me. When I reached the threshold, I hesitated. The air inside the room was different, heavier, thicker, like stepping into a space that didn't belong. I reached for the doorknob, ready to close it again. But then, a whisper, soft, so quiet I almost thought I had imagined it. But it had been real. Right behind me, I spun around, my breath coming in short gasps. The hallway was empty, nothing but shadows and silence. But the moment I turned back to the room, my stomach dropped. The dust on the floor, undisturbed when I first found the room, was different now. There were footprints, bare human footprints, leading from the center of the room to the door, to where I was standing. I slammed the door shut and ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. I barely slept, every sound making my pulse spike. I told myself I'd get out first thing in the morning, that I'd leave the house behind and never come back. But when I woke up, heart pounding, my body drenched in sweat, I knew something was wrong before I even opened my eyes, because the air felt different. And then I heard it, the slow creak of a door swinging open. I turned my head, dreading what I already knew I would see. The door to the 8th room was open again. I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed. My breath caught in my throat. The door to the 8th room stood wide open, yawning into the hallway like a hungry mouth. The air was thick, heavy, pressing against my skin like invisible hands. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, just exhaustion twisting reality. But then, the floor creaked. A single step. From inside the room, my heart slammed against my ribs. I lay frozen in my bed, every instinct screaming at me to stay still, to not look. But my eyes were already drifting toward the darkened doorway, unable to resist. And that's when I saw it. A shadow. Faint, barely visible in the dim hallway. Not cast by the moonlight, not belonging to me. It stood just beyond the doorway, motionless. Watching. I squeezed my eyes shut. This isn't real. This isn't real. The floor creaked again. Closer. I forced my body to move, throwing myself out of bed. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I turned on the flashlight and pointed it toward the hallway. Nothing. The doorway was still open, but the shadow was gone. The floor was empty. The air still carried that strange, suffocating heaviness. But I saw nothing. No one. But then I made the mistake of looking down. The footprints had moved. The dusty imprints I had seen the night before, the ones leading to the door, were different now. Now they led away from the room, down the hall, toward my bedroom. I staggered back, slamming the door shut and locking it. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pressed my back against the wall, my mind racing. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. But my legs wouldn't move. My body wouldn't stop shaking. And then, a whisper, so close it might have been inside my own head. A voice so soft it barely existed. You counted wrong. I don't remember falling asleep. One moment, I was pressing myself against the wall, my body locked in fear. The next, I was waking up to the pale light of dawn filtering through my window. My head ached. My limbs felt heavy. For a brief, blissful second, I thought maybe it had all been a nightmare. Then I turned my head. The door to the 8th room was still open. I sat up, my pulse quickening. The footprints in the dust, they were still there, leading from the room to my door. But something was different. Something was wrong. There were more of them now. Not just a single set. 2. I swallowed hard, my skin prickling with cold. I forced myself to breathe, to focus. Maybe I had been sleepwalking. Maybe my exhausted mind was making mistakes, turning shadows into something worse. But I knew better. I knew. I had to leave. I grabbed my car keys and my bag, not even bothering to change out of my clothes. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. But as I stepped into the hallway, I stopped, because something caught my eye. Something wrong. The layout of the house. The hallway. The doors. The number of them. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. There were 9 rooms. My stomach twisted, nausea bubbling in my chest. That wasn't possible. It wasn't. But the hallway stretched longer than it had before. At the very end, where there had once been just a wall, another door stood waiting. I stared at it, dread crawling up my spine like a cold hand. I didn't want to open it. I knew I shouldn't. But some part of me, some deep, horrible part, was already moving forward. I stepped closer, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. The door loomed in front of me, featureless and wrong. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob. The moment my fingers touched the metal, a sound rang out. A slow, deliberate creak. The door was opening from the inside. The last thing I saw before everything went dark, before my mind shattered and reality bent around me, was a perfect copy of myself standing on the other side, smiling. The first time it happened, I convinced myself it was the wind. I lived alone in a small house on the edge of the forest, miles away from the nearest town. It was peaceful during the day, quiet and still. At night, though, the woods felt different. The darkness seemed deeper, pressing against my windows like something alive. That night, as I sat on my couch scrolling through my phone, I heard it. A soft, deliberate knock on the window. I froze. My skin prickled with unease. My nearest neighbor was miles away. No one should have been out here. The knock came again, 3 slow, measured taps against the glass. I turned my head toward the living room window. The curtains were drawn. I couldn't see who or what was on the other side. I stood up slowly, my heartbeat in my throat. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal? A tree branch? Someone lost? But I knew, deep down, it wasn't any of those things. The knock had been too precise, too human. I hesitated, then moved toward the window. My hands trembled as I reached for the curtain. I took a deep breath and yanked it open. Nothing. The yard outside was empty, the dark forest stretching out in the distance. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, wide-eyed and pale. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. Then, knock, knock, knock. I spun around. The sound had come from the window behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped. The knock had come from the window in the kitchen, on the opposite side of the house. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. Something was moving. Fast. I tried to stay calm. Think logically. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe some kid had wandered too far from town. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. No one walked this deep into the woods at night. No one. I stepped into the kitchen, every muscle in my body tight with fear. The window over the sink was small, the curtains half drawn. My fingers hovered over the fabric. I didn't want to look. Knock, knock, knock. The sound came from the back of the house. My stomach dropped. It was moving, circling. A horrible thought crept into my mind. It's testing me, watching how I react. I grabbed the biggest knife I could find and backed into the center of the room, my eyes darting from window to window. I needed to get to my car. My keys were on the counter. If I was fast enough, I could make it. Then, from the window closest to me, tap, tap, tap. Not a knock this time. Lighter. Closer. My throat closed up. Something was right there, inches from me, separated only by a thin pane of glass. I didn't want to look, but my body betrayed me. My eyes flicked to the window. At first, I thought I was looking at a reflection, a shape in the glass, faint and shifting. Then I realized the shape was on the outside. The figure stood too still, too dark against the night. No features, no face, just a tall, hunched shadow pressing against the glass. Its fingers, long and wrong, tapping. I stumbled backward, the knife shaking in my grip. My mind screamed at me to run, to move, to do anything. Then the tap stopped. I barely had time to process the silence before I heard it. A new sound. Worse than the knocking. Worse than the tapping. The creak of my back door opening. The creak of the back door sent a spike of pure terror through me. It was inside. I didn't think. I ran. My bare feet pounded against the floor as I sprinted toward the front door, my pulse roaring in my ears. My hands fumbled for the deadbolt, shaking so badly I could barely grip it. Click. I wrenched the door open, lunging outside into the freezing night air. My car. My keys. Go. I raced toward the driveway, but the second I stepped off the porch, my breath hitched. The woods loomed ahead, black and endless, and from somewhere inside them, something moved. A rustling, a shifting of branches. And then, knock, knock, knock. I whirled around, my stomach twisting into knots. My house stood silent, every window dark. But the knocking wasn't coming from inside anymore. It was coming from the forest, knocking on wood. My breath came fast and shallow. A tree? No, it wasn't random. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone or something was standing just out of sight, knocking on the trees one by one. My car was only a few steps away, but my body refused to move. The knocking continued, spreading. One tree, then another, then another. The sound echoed all around me, circling, growing closer. Then silence. The air felt wrong. Thick, heavy. A deep, gut-wrenching feeling of being watched. I turned my head, slowly, carefully, toward the woods. At first, I saw nothing but shadows between the trees. Then my eyes adjusted. A shape stood at the edge of the forest. Tall, unmoving, its limbs too long, too thin. Watching me. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its gaze. And then, in the stillness, it did something worse than knock. It stepped forward. One slow, deliberate step out of the woods, its movements unnatural, jerky, like it wasn't used to walking, like it was learning. My body kicked into overdrive. I sprinted for the car, yanking the door open, my fingers barely managing to jam the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and my headlights flooded the yard. For a split second, I saw it. Fully. Its body was humanoid, but wrong. Too thin, its joints too sharp. Its skin was stretched, dark, blending into the night. And its face, it had none. Just smooth, empty skin where eyes, a nose, a mouth should be. Then it moved. Not ran. Not walked. It shifted. One moment it stood in my headlights, the next it was closer. A blur. A distortion in the air. I screamed, slamming the car into reverse, tires kicking up gravel as I shot backward onto the road. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. But as I sped away, heart hammering, one final sound made my blood run cold. Knock, knock, knock. Not on my house. Not on the trees. On my back windshield. I didn't look. Couldn't. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my foot pressing the gas pedal to the floor. The knocking on my rear windshield was impossibly loud, 3 slow, deliberate taps. I swerved, nearly losing control as I sped down the empty road. The knocking didn't come again, but I could feel it. Something was still there, watching me, waiting. The road stretched on in front of me, endless and dark, swallowed by the towering trees on either side. My only light came from the high beams cutting through the night. I needed to reach town, to find people, to be anywhere but here. Then, in the glow of my headlights, a figure, standing in the middle of the road. Tall, motionless. I gasped, my heart slamming against my ribs as I jerked the wheel to avoid it. My tires screeched, the car skidding sideways. Gravel spat up in every direction. I barely managed to regain control before straightening out, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked in the rearview mirror. Nothing. The road was empty. But I knew what I saw. I kept driving, my hands shaking, refusing to slow down. I gritted my teeth, forcing my mind to focus. Just get to town. Just get to town. Then my headlights flickered. For half a second, the world was swallowed in darkness. And when they came back on, it was standing on the side of the road. Closer. I screamed. The car fishtailed as I floored the gas, pushing the engine harder than I ever had. The speedometer climbed 40, 50, 60. Trees blurred past. I didn't care. I just had to escape. But then, knock, 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 on my side window. I didn't turn my head. I didn't dare. But out of the corner of my eye, I saw the shape. A dark mass, pressed against the glass, keeping pace with my car despite me going nearly 70 miles per hour. It had no face, but I felt it looking at me. My vision blurred with tears. This wasn't possible. Couldn't be possible. Then, the knocking stopped. The pressure in the air shifted, and the shape outside my window was gone. I kept driving, refusing to stop, refusing to look back. When I finally reached town, I pulled into a brightly lit gas station and slammed the car into park, my whole body shaking. For a long time, I just sat there, hands gripping the wheel, breath coming in sharp gasps. My brain refused to process what had happened, what I had seen. Then, finally, I turned to look at my window, and I saw it. A single, hand-shaped smear on the glass. Too long, too thin, and beneath it, traced into the condensation from my panicked breath. Let me in. The house had been in my family for generations, abandoned for decades. When I inherited it, I expected to find dust, decay, maybe some forgotten relics from the past. But I never expected him. The portrait. It hung in the main hallway, massive and oppressive. A dark painting of a man I didn't recognize. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, his mouth twisted into a tight, unreadable expression. The background was nothing but blackness, swallowing the details of his form. I had never seen this painting before. My parents had never mentioned it. Yet it hung there, untouched by time, as if waiting for me. I should have taken it down immediately, but something about it made me hesitate. A strange unease curled in my stomach every time I looked at it. That night, as I settled into the house, I kept catching glimpses of it in my peripheral vision. Felt wrong. The way his eyes seemed to follow me, the way his expression seemed different. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. But then, I saw it. His lips had parted just slightly. A thin gap where his mouth had been closed before. I stepped closer, heart pounding. Had I imagined it? Had it always been that way? I shook my head, forcing a laugh. I was exhausted. My mind was playing tricks on me. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The house creaked, The wind howled outside, and beneath it all, I swore I heard something else. A slow, raspy breath. The next morning, when I walked past the painting, my stomach lurched. His mouth was open wider. I stood frozen, my eyes locked on the portrait. The man's mouth, his tight-lipped expression from yesterday was gone. Now his lips were parted wider, as if caught mid-breath. His hollow eyes seemed deeper, darker, more aware. I swallowed hard. This wasn't possible. Paintings didn't change. My mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe I had misremembered. Maybe the house was messing with my head. But as I stared at the portrait, an unbearable unease settled in my gut. It was wrong. I grabbed an old sheet from a closet and threw it over the painting, blocking it from view. My hands trembled as I smoothed the fabric down. There. Done. Out of sight, out of mind. But as I turned away, I felt it. A shift in the air. Like something was watching. That night, I locked my bedroom door. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just an old painting. A trick of the light. A house full of memories pressing against my mind. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. And then, a sound. Soft, faint, fabric shifting. I held my breath, my body stiff with dread. The sheet. I wanted to believe it was the wind, but the windows were closed. The air was still. Then came another sound. Worse, a quiet tap, from just outside my bedroom door. I squeezed my eyes shut. My pulse pounded in my ears. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Tap, tap. It wasn't loud. It was deliberate, as if someone or something was standing just outside, waiting. And then, just as I thought it had stopped, a whisper. Low, dry, impossible to understand. But close, right outside my door. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stop myself from making a sound. The whispering went on for what felt like hours. A steady, rasping murmur just beyond the wood. Then silence. I didn't sleep. I stayed curled beneath the covers. Eyes locked on the door. Every nerve in my body on fire. At sunrise, I forced myself out of bed. The house was quiet. Nothing had changed. I told myself I imagined it. A half-dream, the lingering effects of stress. But when I stepped into the hallway, my stomach twisted into a tight, suffocating knot. The sheet I had thrown over the painting? It was on the floor. And the man in the portrait? He was smiling. I staggered back, my breath hitching in my throat. The man in the portrait was smiling. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't my imagination. His gaunt face, once stiff with an unreadable expression, had shifted into something else. A grin. Thin lips curled upward, stretched too wide, almost unnatural. His sunken eyes seemed deeper, the black void behind him swallowing even more of his form. A cold, crawling dread slithered up my spine. Paintings don't change, but this one had. I grabbed the sheet off the floor, hands shaking, and threw it over the portrait again. This time I didn't smooth it down. I pressed it against the frame, holding it there, as if that would make a difference. My heart was hammering. I needed to get rid of it. I turned and hurried to the kitchen, rifling through drawers until I found a box cutter. I wasn't sure what I was planning to do. Tear the canvas? Burn it? Throw it outside? But I knew one thing. I wasn't keeping it. When I got back to the hallway, the sheet was still in place. I let out a shaky breath and reached for it, gripping the edge. I needed to see it one more time. Needed to know if I was really losing my mind. I pulled the sheet away, and I nearly screamed. The man was closer. He had moved. Not just his face, his entire position. The dark void behind him had shrunk, like he had stepped forward, his shoulders and upper torso pushing out of the darkness. The grin was wider now, teeth barely visible beneath the stretched lips. His sunken eyes burned with something new. Recognition. Like he saw me. Like he knew me. The box cutter slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the hardwood. My legs locked up, but my instincts screamed at me to move, to run. I turned on my heel and sprinted to the front door. My hands fumbled with the lock, breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The metal turned, finally, and I yanked the door open, stepping out onto the porch. The cold air hit me like a slap. The morning was still, the sun barely rising over the trees. The world outside was normal, safe. I sucked in gulps of fresh air, trying to calm my racing heart. Then, a sound from inside the house. A slow, deliberate creak. I turned, dread sinking its claws into my chest. The door to the hallway, the one leading to the portrait, was closing. Not slamming. Not swinging from the wind. Closing. As if someone on the other side was pushing it shut. I didn't wait to find out who or what. I grabbed my keys from the side table, ran to my car, and sped out of there so fast my tires kicked up gravel. I didn't stop driving until I reached a motel 3 towns over. I paid in cash, locked the door behind me, and sat on the bed, staring at the wall for what felt like hours. My mind replayed everything. The whispers, the shifting expression, the way he had moved. I told myself I would never go back, that I would leave the house behind and never set foot in it again. And for a while I kept that promise. But 3 days later, in the middle of the night, I woke up in my motel room. Something was off. The air was heavier. The room felt wrong. Then I noticed it. A shape, barely visible in the darkness, standing in the corner. I reached for the bedside lamp, my fingers trembling. The light flicked on. Nothing. The corner was empty. I let out a shaky breath, running a hand over my face. Just a nightmare. Just my paranoia catching up to me. Then my eyes flicked to the mirror on the opposite wall. And my heart stopped. Because in the reflection, the corner wasn't empty. He was there. Smiling. Couldn't breathe. He was there. In the mirror's reflection, the man from the portrait stood in the corner of my motel room. Closer than before. His gaunt frame loomed in the dim light, his hollow eyes locked onto mine. His grin had stretched even wider, his lips curled too high, as if the skin barely contained it. I spun around, but the corner was empty. My stomach twisted. No. I looked back at the mirror. He was still there. I stumbled back, my pulse hammering in my ears. My brain screamed at me to run, to move, but I couldn't. My body felt heavy, trapped in the weight of his gaze. Then, in the mirror, he took a step forward. My breath hitched. My real room, the one I stood in, remained still. But the mirror version? He was moving. Another step. Then another. He was getting closer. I scrambled backward, grabbing for my keys, my heart slamming against my ribs. My hands fumbled as I turned toward the door. I refused to look back at the mirror. I wouldn't. I yanked the door open, stepping out into the freezing night air. But something stopped me. A whisper. Low. Right behind me. You shouldn't have looked. A cold, dry breath brushed against my ear. I ran. I don't remember getting in the car. I don't remember starting the engine. All I know is that one moment I was in that room, and the next I was flying down the highway, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles ached. The motel lights faded behind me, swallowed by the dark. I didn't stop driving until the sun rose. I should have burned that house down. I should have destroyed that painting when I had the chance. But it was too late now, because the next time I checked my rearview mirror, he was sitting in my back seat, smiling. I live alone. I always have. I keep my doors locked, my windows shut, my security system armed. I'm careful. But none of that mattered. The first time it happened, I thought I had forgotten. I woke up shivering. My blanket had slipped off the bed, and the air felt strangely cold. I groggily sat up, rubbing my arms. Then I saw it. My front door was wide open. The hallway beyond yawned into darkness, the night air seeping into the house. My breath caught in my throat. I knew for a fact that I had locked it before going to bed. Double-locked it. I forced myself out of bed, every step feeling like I was wading through ice. I peeked outside, my pulse hammering. Nothing. The street was quiet. No signs of forced entry. No footsteps on the porch. I shut the door, locking it again, twice. Maybe I had forgotten. Maybe I hadn't latched it properly. Maybe. But the next night it happened again. This time, I set up my security camera. If someone was getting inside, I would catch them. I double-checked the locks, pulled on the door to make sure it was secure, and went to bed with my heart pounding. I barely slept. When I woke up, the door was wide open again. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking, and checked the security footage. My stomach twisted as the video played. From 11 p.m. to 3:32 a.m., nothing happened. The house was still. The door remained shut. Then, at 3:33 a.m. exactly, the door slowly swung open. By itself. I stared at the footage, my fingers numb. The door had opened on its own. No one was there. No movement, no shadows, nothing. Just an empty doorway yawning into the night. I replayed it over and over, hoping for some kind of explanation. A draft? A mechanical failure? But I knew better. I had locked it. Twice. The deadbolt. The chain. Both undone. I felt sick. My house was supposed to be safe. I was supposed to be safe. That night, I stayed awake. I sat in my living room, eyes locked on the door, my phone gripped tightly in my hand. The clock ticked slowly, each minute stretching into eternity. Midnight passed, then 1 a.m., then 2, then 3:30. I held my breath. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might give me away. 3:31. The house was silent. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. 3:32. A bead of sweat rolled down my back. My hands ached from clenching my phone. I forced myself to breathe, to stay calm. Then, 3:33. The lock clicked. I stopped breathing. The deadbolt slid open. The chain unhooked itself. And then the door began to open. Slowly, deliberately, the air around me turned heavy, suffocating. My limbs felt frozen, like something was pressing down on me. The door creaked, inching wider. The darkness outside was thick, impossible to see through. My mouth went dry. I wanted to move, couldn't. And then, just beyond the doorway, something stepped inside. I didn't see it, not fully, but I felt it. A cold presence. Wrong. The air in the room shifted, a quiet pressure settling over me. I could hear it, soft, deliberate breathing. Right next to me, my body finally snapped out of its paralysis. I scrambled backward, my phone slipping from my grasp, my breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. Then, in the silence, a voice, so close it could have been inside my own head. "You left it open for me." My stomach twisted. The voice was right next to me, cold, low, almost amused. The air around me felt thick, pressing against my skin like unseen hands. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My body screamed at me to run, but I was frozen. The door stood open, wide open. Beyond it, nothing but darkness. And yet, something had stepped inside. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. The presence moved closer, the temperature in the room plummeting. My breath came out in short, uneven gasps. The thing wasn't touching me, but I could feel it hovering just inches away. Watching, waiting, then footsteps, soft, slow, pacing around me in the dark. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms, willing myself to move. "Run, run, run." A whisper, impossibly close. "Why did you let me in?" That was enough. My body finally responded. I lunged for the door, slamming it shut with all my strength. My hands fumbled for the lock, my breath ragged, my vision swimming. Click, click. I locked everything, deadbolt, chain, latch. My whole body trembled. I stepped back, pressing my back against the wall, eyes locked on the door. Silence. The house was still. I waited, straining to hear anything. But the air felt normal again. Lighter. Empty. Had it left? I stayed there for hours, barely daring to blink. When the first rays of sunlight streamed through the window, I finally let out a shaky breath. Maybe it was gone. I forced myself to move, to check the house. Every door, every window, every corner. Everything was exactly as it should be. But something nagged at me. Something was wrong. I checked my phone, scrolling back to the security footage. My fingers trembled as I replayed the moment from last night. 3:33 a.m. The lock clicked. The door creaked open. My body stiffened as I watched the darkened doorway. Then movement. Something stepped inside. A blur. A shape. Its form was impossible to make out, shifting, blending with the darkness. But it was there. And then, just before I slammed the door shut, turned, and I saw them. Eyes. Black sunken holes where eyes should be, staring directly at the camera. And the worst part? The footage didn't end there. I had stayed in the living room all night, convinced I was alone. But as the recording continued, my blood turned to ice. Because while I sat there, breathless, gripping my knees, eyes locked on the door, something else was standing right behind me. I dropped the phone. My whole body went numb. Something had been behind me. I replayed the footage, forcing myself to watch. My past self sat frozen in the living room, eyes locked on the door, completely unaware. And just behind me, barely visible in the shadows, a figure, tall, thin, wrong. Its face hovered just above my shoulder, inches away, watching me. I hadn't seen it. I hadn't felt it. But it had been there. The realization made my stomach churn. If it had been inside the house the whole time, then slamming the door, locking the deadbolt, none of it had mattered. I had trapped myself in with it. A cold wave of nausea washed over me. My fingers trembled as I turned off the video. My mind was screaming at me to run, get out, leave the house and never come back. But then, knock, knock, knock. My breath hitched. It was coming from the front door. Not frantic, not impatient, slow, expectant. I stared at the door, heart hammering. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, my phone vibrated in my lap. A notification. Motion detected at front door. With shaking hands, I opened the security app. The camera feed loaded, and my blood ran cold. There was no one there, but the knocking continued. Knock, knock, knock. Louder this time, closer. And then, from behind me, knock, knock, knock. I didn't turn around. Couldn't. The air in the room was different. Heavy, pressing against my skin. And then the voice, right behind my ear. You keep locking the door. But I'm already inside. The lights flickered. The air turned ice cold. And as I finally forced myself to move, as I turned my head just slightly, I saw the shadow stretching across the floor. Not mine. The last thing I remember was my own scream, the darkness swallowing me whole.